Hey guys, welcome to Kindness Matters, where we talk about mental health and life through an understanding and an application of kindness. I want to talk about emotional regulation today. Um, Emotional regulation, just being the understanding of how to contextualize our emotions and work with them, really, rather than being governed by our emotions. We are affected by our emotions, but without being whipped around and without our emotions dictating the state of our life for us. We have some ability to influence our life despite our emotions. So, obviously, an integral skill in the ability to be a well person, a happy person, because we're human beings, and human beings are largely emotionally geared and structured. We like to think of ourselves as logic systems, and to some extent we are. There's definitely logic there, and it's definitely a big part of what it means to be a human being, using our wonderfully developed frontal lobes to formulate and execute complex ideas and plans. But our emotion systems can override that, and what brings in the joy of being a human being is the emotional experience, because emotions are what give us experience, contentment, happiness, grief. All of these things are what take us through the phases and experiences of life, sometimes enjoyably so, and sometimes not so enjoyably so. I don't like to talk about emotions as positive or negative, and in order to talk about emotional regulation, we have to have some brief understanding of emotions. I don't like to talk about them as good or bad or positive or negative, because emotions all have an important purpose. When allowed to serve their important purpose, they help us be human, and they help us be the best version of ourselves that we can be. And we can't stop ourselves from experiencing emotions. They come and they go. They are ignited by different situations, sometimes triggered by external stimuli, things that happen outside of ourselves, uh, experiences, conversations, overhearing something, seeing something on TV, ignites an internal experience that can be comfortable, can be uncomfortable. And sometimes they're triggered by internal experiences, a memory, an intrusive thought, um, sometimes a sense of fatigue or a burst of energy that comes from us can trigger an emotion, sometimes a comfortable emotion and sometimes an uncomfortable emotion. And these are the words I really like to use in terms of emotions. The the comfort or discomfort being, is this a pleasurable emotion to experience, or is it an unpleasurable emotion to experience? There's even some oversimplification there, but we don't need to go too deep into it. So why do we need to regulate these emotions? If we don't regulate the emotions will govern the circumstances of our life. Now, we can't control emotions. And when we try to control emotions, that's us acting as logic systems. And historically, it just leads to a bad time. It leads to suppression of emotions that then come out sideways after they've bottled up too much, often in abusive ways, sometimes abusive towards others, sometimes abusive towards ourselves. Even comfortable emotions that are unregulated can have adverse consequences on one's life. If I have an unregulated sense of joy, then I can make impulsive decisions. I can spend money that was meant to help build some part of my life. I can spend it impulsively on something that I didn't really need. I can get into sexual encounters which I would have preferred not to, just because I was excited in a moment. I can overcommit in relationships because I felt a deep sense of love and affection in a moment, way too early in a relationship, before I actually knew the full nature of the person I'm making these commitments to. Just like, oh wow, I've got such powerful feelings for you. Our dates have been going so well. Let's live together. And now we live together, and our sometimes less desirable traits start to come to the surface, and possibly some incompatibilities come to the surface. All made out of a place of positive emotion, but unregulated positive emotion. And then obviously on the uncomfortable side, see there, I'm catching myself saying positive emotion and negative emotion as well. It's easy to fall into and important to challenge. Unregulated comfortable emotion. And on the uncomfortable side, obviously an unregulated sadness can drown us in a feeling of depression. An unregulated irritation can escalate into anger and aggressive behavior. I think it's easier to understand where unregulated, uncomfortable emotions can lead, but it can also be more difficult to understand why it's so difficult to regulate uncomfortable emotions, because uncomfortable emotions hurt us, and they're often caused by experiences that aren't our fault. And we can want those experiences to resolve and hope that the resolution of those experiences will solve these uncomfortable emotions and allow them to move on. But often that's not going to happen. If I have a sense of persistent offense, where I'm constantly angry at people I work with, or perhaps people I grew up with, because of things that have happened in the past and I can't let go of them, maybe a partner who cheated on me in the past, and I don't have an ability to regulate this emotion to a level that I can experience it and process it and allow it to move through and move on, it can dominate my experience to a point that I become distrustful. I feel very unsafe and very unhappy in my world. And it's not my fault. I haven't done anything wrong. And I can want these people to apologize or to explain what happened, but maybe they're unable to recognize what they've done as having the effect on it relevantly and sensibly that it has on me. Maybe they're not available. Maybe they've passed on or just moved on out of our lives and we can't reach them. But in so many circumstances, if we're expecting other people to resolve our emotions, then our emotions are in control of those people, which is a lot of power to give someone over our experience. When we are able to regulate our emotions, we can bring them to a level, often very powerful emotions. We can, through time and guidance, assistance, support, and skill, we can bring them to a level that we can then engage with them without being shut down by them or without being sent off by them, where they can then be processed. Processing an emotion, being allowing it to come out in a way that is safe and productive and doesn't cause unnecessary harm to myself or the people around me, and allows me to move through into different emotional states. So like some of the experiences I mentioned now could build into self-pity, which could build into a low self-esteem, which could build into a distrustfulness because I don't believe people will fight for me or stick around, which could build into a possessiveness, which could build into abusiveness easily. Whether abusiveness towards others or abusiveness towards self. Abusiveness towards self and being, maybe I'm not going to get into relationships and I'm going to live out this lonely life without ever opening myself up to the potential of finding a healthy partner. Or perhaps I am going to allow myself to be taken advantage of by unhealthy partners because, that's all there is, and I haven't resolved the fact that there's a different experience available. So the first part of regulating emotions is really to identify the emotion. There are different ways in which we can achieve this. Often we're limited by vocabulary. The human experience is often lived through the framework of language, right? I think it's important to be able to have experiences that aren't limited by our vocabulary and by the language available to us, because there are emotions that we don't have words for or don't have words for in the language we know. um, but the studies have shown that having a wider and more robust emotional vocabulary can help us identify emotions better, and once we've identified our emotions, be able to respond to and regulate them better. A really well-known and effective means of doing this is the wheel of emotions. I can't remember right now who came up with this, but this is such a powerful tool that I often use with my clients, because it allows people to expand their emotional vocabulary by taking a simple, more easily identifiable emotion such as anger, happiness, sadness, surprise, disgust, fear, listed all of them there, and then giving it nuance. Disgust being able to look into avoidance, and then avoidance into aversion or hesitancy, or yeah, and happy. I can see, oh, okay, I'm feeling happy. I know that I'm feeling a positive emotion. I can identify that, and that can be identified as happy. And then it's like, what kind? Is it joyful, which is maybe more on the energetic side of happiness, or is it something peaceful, which is on the less energetic side of happiness? And then go from that into, well, maybe I'm feeling hopeful, or maybe I'm feeling loving towards myself or something around me or someone around me. And it's just a really good tool for expanding our emotional vocabulary and tracking our emotions through their nuances. I don't think it's perfect, because I think even here, despite the level of nuance that it offers, it's still quite limited. And I think we all also have individual relationships with different words where our definitions might not be exactly the same, and sometimes through this we can force ourselves into a specific definition that doesn't feel true. But it's a good starting point, and an important thing in mental health and in life is to have a starting point of understanding that we can then build on and develop into something personal, right? So that's the first thing. We learn to identify the emotion, because then we at least know what we're regulating. I like to start off with uncomfortable or comfortable, and then go into a name, happiness, and then joy, and then whatever goes on from there. If I'm struggling to identify emotion, often with my uncomfortable emotions, I'll have coping mechanisms that kick in that prevent me from seeing that I'm in an uncomfortable state. I might be feeling just suddenly more energetic. I might have a physical experience of the emotion and hyper alert, and then I'll be able to track that physical experience into a sense of anxiety through having gotten to know myself. And this is again where things like therapy, things like some form of mentorship, having a trusted other, even online forums that help us understand and engage, where we can learn together with other people how to work through this process and develop our mechanisms, right? So often many of us will feel that physical experience and track that into an identifiable emotion. Fatigue can be tracked into depression, can be tracked into sadness, can be tracked into a fear of failure. And then that fear of failure can be processed and responded to, whether internally through just sitting with it, or externally through making some sort of change in our lives. And also what I like about the emotional wheel is the colors. Sometimes if people can't identify the words for their emotions, I'll ask them, like, can you give it a color? Does that color feel good to you? Does that color feel bad to you? What kind of previous experiences have you felt that color of emotion in? And then from there, we can start identifying how this person relates to their emotions. And we don't necessarily have to use the typical terminology. We can have a color wheel of emotions if that's what works for us. We can have a number system for emotions if that's what works for us. Positive emotions being in or comfortable emotions being in the positive spectrum of numbers, and uncomfortable emotions being in the negative spectrum of numbers. And we can give different ranges in 1 to 10, 10 to 20, etc. Right? So the second part of emotional regulation is looking at the appropriateness of an emotion. Now, I think it's important to say that there's never a fully inappropriate emotion. I don't think, because emotions are what come from us, and in some way our system has identified this as an appropriate emotion mapped to this system. But sometimes our system is running on lessons that are misguided. If I grew up in a very unsafe environment, and perhaps there was a large man in my environment who was abusive, maybe I had an abusive dad while I was very small, then later on in life, I might be scared of large men in general, and when I'm around them, feel a sense of fear. Maybe I had someone in my life who gave me a big fright. Maybe I had a hijacking, and there was somebody who had a mustache, and for some unknown reason, every time I'm around someone who has a mustache, I feel unsettled. And the appropriateness of an emotion allows us to check, does this emotion map accurately to the experience I'm having? And when I say map accurately, I'm saying, does it serve a reasonable purpose? Therefore, if I'm feeling unsafe, if I'm feeling a sense of anxiety and a sense of nervousness, this usually denotes some sort of threat in my environment. And I can look around and say, is there a threat here? Often this is important with social anxiety, where I can look around and be like, these are my closest friends. I feel like they don't want me here because I'm struggling to hear what's going on in the conversation, and that's making me feel very uncertain of whether or not I'm contributing well to the conversation, and that's making me feel uncertain of whether or not I have a place in the conversation. And I'm worried that other people feel like I don't have a place in the conversation. And then I remind myself, like, these people invited me here, or they came over of their own accord, and I know that they love me. They've told me that they love me. They've told me that they enjoy my character, my conversation. And I can respond to that emotion by challenging the thoughts that drive it. And that would be a cognitive way of regulating the emotion, responding directly to the thoughts that are attached to the emotion. Or a physical way of regulating it might be to stim in some way. Maybe to, if I'm feeling very excited, just touch earth, to hold on to something warm, to give myself a little bit of a squeeze and just bring myself in. We can have interactional ways of regulating this emotion, where we learn to talk to people and say out loud, sure, guys, I'm feeling, the old tickers playing games and making me doubt my role here. And just expressing that and giving it that release can sometimes bring the level of intensity down to a point that we can engage with it. And even on the comfortable side of emotions, it's not always appropriate to feel good. If I am generally feeling happy at work, and yet I'm not performing, I'm feeling so happy, I'm walking around, talking to my colleagues, but people are getting frustrated with me because they feel like I'm not contributing to the work of the team, and perhaps my job is becoming insecure, or maybe even the company itself is struggling financially, and the reality is that my job is insecure, and I'm walking around on cloud nine. This is not necessarily appropriate, because a sense of worry here would possibly motivate me to send out my CV, or to double down on my application of my own efforts at work. And if my job is on the rocks, it's appropriate for me to feel worried. If I'm going into a relationship and perhaps we've been arguing a lot lately, feeling a sense of worry there, or a sense of uncertainty, is appropriate, because that's going to motivate me to to make changes. This is something that I've personally struggled with, where I would be blind somehow to the fact that the relationship's not doing well. And I've got this blind sort of optimism that, we've really been in a good space lately. And then my partner turning around and being like, Wes, what are you talking about? Thankfully, it's not something I've experienced recently, because I've had the privilege of being able to do a lot of work on myself and having a lot of support and opportunity in that. But in the past, the younger version of me definitely struggled with that. So the next thing to look at, and the last thing we'll look at for today, is the proportion of the emotion. So it's first, is the emotion I'm feeling mapped accurately to the experience I'm having? Does it serve a role here that can help me progress my life and experience, that points me in a safe direction or keeps me in a safe place? And then, is the intensity of it appropriate? This is, I think, the best emotion to discuss here is anger. If we look at the emotions, well, here, what have we got with anger? We've got anger, and then in anger we've got frustrated and we've got irritated. So I think it's important to be able to feel irritated without feeling anger, and possibly even going further into anger, into rage. We see all these memes online of the Karens of the world, who go into a shop and experience an objectively and reasonably irritating experience. Oh, I'm having to wait in a queue. The cashier's having to go look up a price. The product description doesn't perfectly describe the product. And these poor women go into a state of rage. That's an unregulated emotion. They're screaming, they're shouting, they're attacking service workers, becoming abusive and dismissive and disregarding. But let's look at these people for a moment as well, and understand that this person's world is very difficult, where they feel so out of control in their life that this slight sign of the world not functioning the way that it should is beyond their capacity to regulate their experience. So they just go, whoops, straight over the top. And they're experiencing that as a form of emotional pain. And I think there's room for compassion for that. I think there's room for boundaries, and I think there has to be boundaries. But I think there's also space for a level of compassion. They could have been irritated. And this again is feeling the emotion in our body and asking ourselves, is this the right size? On the other side, it can be the same as well. We were talking about the work experience or a relationship that's not going well. And perhaps I'm feeling a little bit unsure about the relationship, but maybe I'm being abused, and an appropriate emotion would be rage. I got to stand up and protect myself and gather all my things and get out of here. And yet I'm just feeling mildly annoyed, or I'm feeling frustrated because we've got quite a few problems that we're working on. When meanwhile, I would be served better by an emotion that drives me to direct and conclusive action. I've got to get out of here. If I am noticing somebody following me down the street and I'm feeling vaguely worried, no, this is perhaps a time to actually feel a sense of terror, to feel an acute sense of fear that increases my alertness and increases the physical resources available to me in my body, increases my heart rate, increases my speed of thought, increases the speed of my rudimentary decision making. Do I run? Do I walk? Do I turn left? Do I turn right? And gets me very decisively out of a dangerous situation. So I don't want to go on too much more with this video. I think I've said enough to give a feel for it. If there's any more questions, please drop a comment or reach out to me through DM, and I'll do my best to engage. Guys, all the best, and thank you for your time.